I've been wanting to do an overnight motorcycle trip while out on the trail, but the big question was, how do I carry my gear? And in looking into it, I found some cargo racks that were available online, but I was not impressed with the design of them. So I was hoping I might be able to do a better job of designing it and building it myself. So this is where we get started. I ordered a 5/8 inch die for my tubing bender and went to the metal yard and picked up some 5/8 inch tubing in an 095 wall. I guess the best way to try to explain what I'm making would be to say it's an oval hoop with a 180-degree bend on each end, and then that would just give me one location where I have to do a single butt weld in the tubing. If you've done any tubing bending, you'll know that tubing has a spring back to it when you're trying to bend it. So that was probably the most difficult part in trying to figure out how many degrees to overbend the material so that it would spring back to the location where I wanted it. As you can see, the distance between the tubing clamp and the die, on the first bend we made, I had to leave extra material on the tubing. So now I need to take it out of the tubing bender and cut some of that extra material off. After getting the tubing back in the tubing bender and starting to continue the bend, I realized I needed to cut 1 more inch off. With this 5/8 tubing, I figured out I needed to overbend the tubing approximately 10 degrees on a 180-degree bend. So that's going to cause a problem when we meet up with our very first bend, because that runs into the guide of the tubing bender and won't allow for any overbending. So we're going to have to find another way to finish off this last bend. With my Harbor Freight press and a bit of heat and just a little bit of wrestling with this tubing, I was eventually able to get both of those ends to meet up just perfectly. With the hoop clamped down to my welding table, it's time to try to make a nice butt weld where the two ends meet. I used a bit of 1/4 inch scrap metal to space the hoop up off the fender and then tape it in place while I fabricate the rest of the mounting brackets. Since I was going to be doing some tack welding on the motorcycle, I decided I needed to remove the fuel tank as well as disconnect the battery and the ECU. I already had a piece of 5/8 tubing bent to 90 degrees when I was testing out my new bending die, so I decided to give that a shot and see if I could make that work as one of my brackets. For our mounting locations, we'll utilize the fender to subframe location. And at the hardware store, I found some longer bolts and the perfect size steel spacer, and that's what we'll be welding our bracket to. I wasn't worried about getting any welding splatter on this fender, because I've got a new one sitting on the shelf and I've just been looking for a good reason to put it on. At the front, we'll use the mounting location of the upper subframe bolt. I was originally going to utilize a spacer as I did in back, but I wasn't happy with the fitment of the spacer that I was able to find for that size bolt hole. So I ditched that idea and ended up going with a piece of 1/8 inch thick flat bar, and I notched the end so that it would slide inside the tubing, and then I'll just weld around the end. Too long. Here's the bracket I made out of the 3/4 by 1/8 inch flat bar. And our tubing will slide on like that. Finished bending our last tube. It'll go on like that. Tack weld up here, tack weld on there, and then take everything off and weld it up. Okay, the rack is all tacked together. I took it off the motorcycle. Now I cut some 1/2 inch 065 tubing, 3 pieces that we'll place in here. So we'll get those slid in, tacked in, and then I think we'll try to secure these 3 mounting points to the table, make some kind of jig, and then just to hold those mounting locations in place, and then we'll get this all welded up. Okay, I have somewhat of a little jig made up and clamped to the table to hold these mounting locations rigid while we weld up the rest of this rack. I used my angle grinder with a sanding disc to clean up any sharp spots and welding splatter. Alright guys, I got the rack back from powder coating. I went with a textured finish on the powder coat. It turned out amazing. I absolutely love it. Got it all mounted on the bike, and now the only thing left to do is to put a tent and a sleeping bag on it and test it out on the trail. After arriving at the perfect camp spot, I decided to get out my stove, boil some water, and make a package of chili mac while I enjoyed the sunset. Thanks for watching.